Well, this is Dan Shea with Veterans for Peace. Hello, Portland. Back from the VFP National Convention that took place August 5th through the 9th this year. It was our 30th annual Veterans for Peace convention. We had about 400 people there, 300 to 400 people in and out throughout the convention. It was an incredible period of time. I know many of you are waiting to hear today's guest, those who were tuned into the first two parts of our program on GI Resistor, Chuck Wiley. But before I do that, I want to announce a little shout out to Barb Gerwell, whose father, Ralph William Gerwell, born May 6, 1968, passed away August 9th, 2015 at the age of 87. Ralph Presente. He was in the Army during the Korean conflict, Purple Heart recipient for his involvement in Chosin Reservoir conflict, and was a member of Veterans for Peace Chapter 72. Took up bull riding at the age of 50. I don't know, I wouldn't have taken it up at 19. He loved NASCAR races, country music, camping around Oregon, and was a real cowboy, but he was a cowboy who came to the same position as most of us veterans in the Veterans for Peace, that we need to find a way to end war. There are veterans who we enter with the same idea as most people, that we want to try and make a difference in the world. We're going to protect somebody. We've been told that our enemy is encroaching upon our principles of freedom and democracy, and for the most part, we find out later that there are other motives involved in it, and can no longer participate. Well, Chuck has been here for two programs already. We had somebody in between that period of time. That was Tricia Brownwill, who is a veteran and an artist, who we had last month. But as you know, the program comes on every fourth Saturday of the month. I like to also, do a little shout out, so sometimes I forget at the end of the show, to my producers, Karma DiBella and Jim Lockhart, who have always been there and continue to make this program possible. So we want to always make sure that they get credit for that. It wouldn't exist without them. Well, Chuck, this Chuck Wiley is here. So the first part, we want to go back a little bit. You might give us a little bit of a brief overview. When did you join the military, and how did you end up first deciding to go to Canada?
Well, I first joined the Army in December 1989. Spent a few years working with a signals intelligence company before transferring to the Navy in March of 1992. Mm-hmm. I was an engineer for my time in the Navy, and I went through several commands, including an instructor command, and later in my career, my last command ended up being aboard an aircraft carrier. That aircraft carrier deployed to the Middle East in May of 2006, and my duties expanded. The qualifications I was trying to achieve expanded and exposed me to some other departments on the ship at, I guess, what I could call an unfortunate time for my career. Mm-hmm. The things that I saw while working alongside the operations department, and participating in the air operations were not things that I thought my military did. I was under the impression up to that point that I was one of the good guys. There may be people in the world that don't understand that we're helping them, but we are helping. The end result will be a good result. And what I witnessed there for 4 months of deployment there stood in stark contrast to that. So I brought this up with my chain of command, and at the time it was basically just a questioning period of why are we involved in this? How are we involved in this? I don't understand how this is legal. And of course, I'm a member of a military that holds the Geneva Conventions in the highest regard, and the Nuremberg Principles in the highest regard. So obviously, there's a piece of this puzzle that I'm missing. So I'd like to know what that is. And the response that I got was less than understanding, and generated a situation where things gradually escalated between me and my chain of command, where I asked just to be transferred off the ship. I wanted to go to at that time, the fully half of the fleet that wasn't engaged in the war in the Middle East. So I put in that request. Surprisingly, that request was granted before we returned to our home port in November of that year. And when I got those orders, they were orders to a ship that was transferring to Japan, which would be prohibited by law from participating in a war outside those territorial waters. So I thought everything was great, showed up to that ship when we returned home, and found out that ship will be doing that home port change at the tail end of another deployment to the Middle East, which was specifically what I asked to avoid. So took those concerns to my chain of command there, got laughed at, took those to Navy Legal, and they told me my option was to board the boat and execute the orders or go to jail. And
question at that point. Just could you have gone through conscientious objector route?
I began that process and then voluntarily dropped it after it was obvious it wasn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
and that was because it wasn't a religious, you weren't tied to a religious?
No, it was because I still don't consider myself a conscientious objector in the, I guess, in the same way that the U.S. military requires. I don't consider myself an overall conscientious objector. I can sit here and honestly tell you I don't have an objection to all violence. I think it's appropriate sometimes to defend yourself.
Well, yeah, I don't call defending yourself violence, but yeah,
well,
in defense, violence occurs, yes.
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 What my particular issue would be more appropriately called selective objection.
Okay.
Where while I am not against, or at the time, my viewpoints changed in the intervening years some, but at the time, I hadn't had a problem with a lot of the wars I've been involved in up to this one. Mm-hmm. I had very serious issues with how that war was started, the war in Iraq. Serious issues with how it was being prosecuted, and it just didn't make any sense to me. So it was that conflict in particular I wanted nothing to do with.
Right.
And the fact that I only wanted nothing to do with that conflict and had no problem with some of the others that we had been involved in bars me from being considered a conscientious objector in the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. Like, selective objection is just not a status they recognize.
Got it. Okay, and then it went from that to where?
I talked to Navy Legal for a while. It became obvious that wasn't going to go anywhere. And spent a while talking to GI Rights, which for many things is a great service. They are necessarily limited in the responses they can give you if they want to maintain access to military bases. But some things that were said to me there and through some other channels led me to find out about a group in Canada that was called the War Resistor Support Campaign. It's still there and doing very well. But I found out about a few people from the Army a few years ahead of me, in 2004. This was the end of 2006 at the time when I was doing this research. Had already gone to Canada for very similar reasons. And a campaign of Canadian citizens had sprung up around them to support their desire to stay in Canada and kind of follow in the footsteps of the people that had come to Canada during the Vietnam crisis and the Vietnam War. So that seemed like a good option to me. I made contact with them, explained who I was, what I wanted to do, and to their credit, they made every attempt to talk me out of it. They told me the political environment doesn't look good here right now. We're not sure how this is going to go. This is going to be a long, difficult fight. It's not going to be a quick and easy thing.
Well, you just didn't go there. You also went there and applied for asylum, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's And you might explain to people what asylum is in an international scale.
Well, it is all governed by the, excuse me, it's all governed by the UN Convention for Human Rights.
Right.
So there are several paragraphs, or there's a whole section there that applies to either like political or social asylum, leaving where you are from because for some reason you feel you're endangered there or won't get a fair shake from that society, and going somewhere else and being allowed to live there outside the normal immigration processes.
Right.
That in a nutshell is what political asylum of any kind is.
Right.
So UNHCR specifically has a few paragraphs that talk about members of a country's military that want to leave their country of origin because they believe they're being asked to do illegal things or being asked to commit human rights violations or commit war crimes.
Right.
And it details how you deal with those people, whether or not they have already been complicit in war crimes or they fear they're going to be complicit in war crimes, and how you deal with military desertion in general. The fact is that in pretty much every country that has military, desertion is a crime. The body that deals with those sorts of claims in Canada is the Immigration and Refugee Board, the IRB. They are a part of the Ministry for Citizenship and Immigration. So they're the first people that you contact. I filed my claim within 24 hours of entering Canada. Explained who I was, why I had come to Canada, what my particular problem was with the Iraq War, why I felt my continued participation was enabling war crimes, and they review the claims. The way the process is supposed to work, they review the claims fairly quickly. You get a hearing in front of a judge who's part of the IRB, and they'll decide yes or no in the case. It's usually fairly quick and billed as being impartial. The problem with the cases of American GIs that were coming to Canada was that the very first few of us that showed up, the at the time Liberal government of Canada got word of what was going on, what was being decided at the IRB, and took a historically significant step of directly intervening in those IRB hearings by sending a Crown lawyer to the hearings to argue against the U.S. soldiers that were showing up. And the argument was basically that there's no way an individual soldier can prove that the war in Iraq is illegal. It's an undecided issue among nations, and because of that, all the other arguments fall flat. And it's certainly something that an individual soldier, like the idea that an individual soldier can argue that his orders are illegal or that the war he's participating in is illegal, falls flat because an individual soldier doesn't have the proper perspective to make those decisions. Which, if you know anything about the Nuremberg principles, you know, like flies directly in the face of those principles.
Right. I mean, that's a catch-22. I mean, it's saying, well, we can't. You're not in a position to make that decision to say whether the war was criminal or not criminal. Plus, they're asking you to prove, that you have all the evidence before you to make that claim. Yet, if you do commit that crime or continue to serve, and it's proven later, after the fact, it's like saying after it's been proven, then we can hold you responsible for it, but we can't do it beforehand. That's is very bizarre position to take. I'm surprised that legal minds even consider that kind of argument. Well,
there was actually early on in this fight, I want to say it was around 2008, but I'd have to check the date. There was a Canadian federal judge who brought up that very point, where they're saying the Crown is asking for this bar of evidence before they're going to accept your claim or accept the soldier's claim that they're being asked to participate in war crimes. But if they have enough evidence to satisfy the Crown, then the UNHCR actually bars them from refugee consideration because they would have been complicit in those war crimes.
Right.
So a federal judge actually told the government, you're intentionally setting these people in a catch-22 where they either can't satisfy Canadian law or they can't satisfy international law.
Right. Well, it just seems so bizarre to me, and And these principles are very important. I mean, I was just telling you earlier, I had just watched that movie, The Judgment at Nuremberg. That was on television today, and this was this was a 1961 film, and it's about, you know, these judges that had in 1947, these judges had served on the bench during the Nazi regime, and it's sort of military, and now facing a military tribunal in Nuremberg for being complicit in sending people to the concentration camps. Most of the judges were pretty mediocre and corrupt in their beliefs and bigoted. But this one judge, Ernst Janney, in the film, played by Burt Lancaster, was a judge who had actually written some pretty profound legal and scholarly pieces that many of the judges in the U.S. and around the world were admired extremely, and found it he couldn't be involved. I mean, there was a sense that he couldn't be involved in this. And throughout the trial, Maximilian, playing the part of his prosecutor, would tear witnesses apart. And Janney finally couldn't bear the idea that they were repeating the same kind of trials that he had conducted, and stood up and basically said that he was guilty in this long speech, which I could not possibly repeat, but it was brilliantly said, and basically said, "I'm guilty, take responsibility. Those," he says, "we did know what was going on, and those who didn't want to know. Purposeful ignorance." But in the end, he accepted his guilt, and he was sentenced to life in prison, along with these other judges. At the end of the film, it says none of them served over 3 years or whatever it might be. But the thing is, he calls in Chief Justice that was prosecuting him and sentenced him, who was Spencer Tracy, played the part, and asked him to understand that one thing he did, you know, he felt his guilt, but that he didn't know that this would lead into the millions that it did. And what I thought was important was that that affected me a lot just watching that, was that Chief Justice Haywood, by Spencer Tracy, says, the minute that you found one, you knew and found one innocent person guilty, it was heading in that direction. And I wonder about, you know, they know. I mean, these judges know that what you're doing is standing up, and many of the veterans that are standing up against these wars, they know in their hearts that this is bullshit, you know, and that and I've been seeing this throughout the world, is that we seem to be heading in that trend again, that sort of political trend that takes people beyond using the law to prosecute people, but not delivering justice. And it was interesting in the film that it was said that one of the judges that spoke up that was being tried, he said, "I did my job. I did it according to the law. I followed the law. It wasn't my position to deliver justice." I thought, that's what it sounds like to me when I hear what you were saying, you know, and it's so, to me, it's so important. And again, you know, you're saying you're looking at the Nuremberg principles and at the United Nations protocols. These are important things that people need to pay attention to. And I think that, you know, I mean, maybe we need to start teaching these things in our curriculums and classes, so that people really understand what it means to be a part of a nation and what our responsibilities in a nation is, both soldiers and civilians. I know that part of that was in my psyche when I entered the military, you know. I don't know if it was because I watched movies and learned a little bit of it. I know I certainly hadn't learned it in history, but there was a purveyor of that consciousness that had an effect upon me. And anybody, I think, forget what they call that, it was sort of an obvious understanding that our nation lived up to those principles. At least we thought so, you know. And I admire people that can see right away that well, or see during a period in their service or their life that we're not living up to those principles, and then
people have to make the decision to stand up.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a difficult position when everybody around you is going along with you know, whatever it is that the direction it's going. They just can't do it. Did you find other people among your colleagues on the ship that felt similar to you, but were just unable to make that transition?
More than a few.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was definitely the most outspoken by far.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I caused the most trouble, I suppose, but I wasn't alone.
Okay.
There were just the support that I got was quiet support, you know, and a lot of times it was, I don't know if I would call it backhanded support, but it was more colleagues quietly telling me that, you know, you're right,
Yeah.
but don't do this. You know, that sort of support
I
was most
understand.
common. I mean, there were, you know, a few junior officers that just decided that they're not going to renew their contract at the end of their contract and things like that, and you know, a few people that decided I'm just leaving early, that had intended to make a career in the military and decided after that deployment that I don't think I will.
Right.
You know, and I mean, through most of this entire run up of things that went wrong on that last deployment, I was still in that boat. I had every intention of finishing my career and retiring.
Right. And you had only how long to go before you retired?
Uh,
You had how many
just
years in?
yeah, just a few years. I mean,
Yeah.
it was over 16 years that I had in.
Yeah, and
Right.
what, it's 20 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 20 years for 50%. You know.
Yeah, that's
So-
pretty darn good. And people, to give that up is a very hard thing to do. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways people stay in and even resist while they're in.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm glad, okay, so you end up and you're in Canada, you're dealing with the asylum process, and then basically it comes to an end, and you know that you're not going to do that. So it now is a journey coming back into the U.S.
Right.
How did that go? What's that transition, and why did you decide? How did you decide to come back in, and what happened after that?
Well, it's it really has to do with the way, I guess, day-to-day life sort of unfolds for somebody who's in that position in Canada, you know, in a foreign country. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do as a citizen in the U.S. that you just sort of take for granted. You don't even think about it. You know, in Canada, if you're not a citizen, there's a lot of difficulty in things like just changing your address and changing your bank account. You know, every month I had to report to the Canadian Border Services regional office and just show up there and wave my hands and say, here I am. I haven't fled to the hills. You know, I have not left Canada without your knowledge.
Have some people fled to the hills?
It's the way that particular requirement sprung up in, well, so to directly answer your question, yes.
Okay.
There have been a few people that just vanish off the radar.
Yeah.
They realize they're going to be kicked out of Canada, so they vanish underground. However, if you consider how long it takes to throw your stuff in the back of a car and disappear into the hills of the Yukon, once a month check-in does nothing to stop that.
Right.
Absolutely nothing at all. So the way that requirement sprung up was more just a way to inconvenience people. You know, it's the Canadian Immigration Services is looking at monstrous queues, and you know they cut the federal government cuts the budget for those services every year, so they lose case officers every year. And they have these massive backlogs of cases, and so the politicians come up with inventive ways to reduce the backlog, like barring medical care for people who have had an initial negative decision from the Immigration and Refugee Board, but are continuing the appeal process that's allowed to them under law. They just remove all of any sort of social support. In a lot of cases, they try to make it difficult for you to work. If you don't hold down steady jobs, every time you change jobs, you have to reprove that you meet all the qualifications to work.
Right.
Which is fine, but then with the reduction in available caseworkers, that paperwork, which they were requiring some people to renew every 3 months, takes sometimes 6 months to renew. So it gets really difficult for people just to carry out day-to-day life.
Right.
I was lucky enough to have a steady job, a very understanding employer, so that wasn't my particular problem. But just it grinds on you after a while, right? Never knowing when you're going to get that letter. It's time to go. It's time to uproot your life and leave, and having to check in continuously. Just a simple everyday act of living, having 10 extra steps to it.
Like carrying a bracelet on your leg.
Yeah, I mean, just because the politicians in power, you're politically inconvenient for them. So, in November of 2014, I finally got my letter. Right, my case came up. I'd been there for 8 years at the time, and they said, okay, it's time for you to leave. And they initially tried to give me 2 weeks to leave. My amazing immigration lawyer and my employer were able to argue successfully that more time is needed for my employer to transition and find someone to replace me. So that was extended to the end of January 2015. And really, at that point, I'd made contact with the Navy in Norfolk, the office that was responsible for prosecuting my case, and we had managed over the course of the previous year to come to terms for the case, and they had decided to discharge me with an other than honorable discharge, file paperwork for an in absentia discharge while I was in Canada. So I took that deal from them, figured all that out, and when my number came up in Canada, like, okay, there's really no reason for me to fight this. There's no reason, because there's a lot of other people in the same boat as I am, and many of us are sharing the same lawyer, and she's been amazing for everybody.
What's her name?
Alyssa Manning.
Alyssa Manning.
Yeah,
That's good.
yeah, she's been
Shout out to Alyssa.
Yeah, she's been an absolutely amazing attorney. Yeah, I mean, I can't say enough good stuff about her. She's a genius. She's just a genius. But her time is valuable, and she's working a lot of these cases essentially pro bono, at a very, very reduced cost. So in a situation where she has 20 people that she's trying to keep out of the stocks, if I'm not facing that danger anymore, it's not really fair for me to suck up her time.
Yeah.
So it was time to come back.
And why was this was Navy courts?
Yeah.
Why was the Navy so willing to make that deal?
Well, I've never actually gotten any official notification of why this happened. I've had to find out through talking to old friends in the military and a couple of newspaper articles here and there. But all the worst times that I had after I started asking questions about this came from 3 specific people in my chain of command. And I don't want to name those guys, but since I left the military, all 3 of those guys at subsequent commands have run into rather severe equal opportunity problems. The way they treat their shipmates, the way they treat their subordinates has become a severe issue for the Navy at some point past when I had an issue with all 3 of them. So I suspect that had a lot to do with it. Maybe somebody realized at some point that if this had been handled differently, the guy might still be in, the guy might have retired. Who knows? That's my personal suspicion.
I understand that very much. I know when I was in the Marines in the Philippines, when I was serving in the Philippines, and I actually just came back out of the brig for an incident that was really a protest. I don't want to get into the details, but I fired my weapon off and was received what they called court captain's mass, which is basically mini court-martial. So, and 30 days in the brig. Well, in the brig, and my rank, which was only E2 at the time, back down to E1, and then pay was taken for the month, and so I come back, and this hair used to be, I could grow hair before, but it was shaved closer than it is now for when you get out of the brig, and the Marines are pretty good at keeping their head shaved anyhow. But at the same time, I come back, and I have a new platoon commander, and he's staff sergeant, and he started right off the bat saying things to me, like, why didn't you you're the crazy guy that shot off his gun, and he just basically saying something like, if I came out on your post, you wouldn't be taking a pot shot at me. I said, oh, well, I might, being an ass, I was going to do that, and I just didn't like the way he was talking to me about it, and so, I'm on for 4 days in the jungle, and come back in, and I'm walking in. For some reason, we're walking by his office. Maybe I had to pick up something, but anyhow, he calls me over the door and says, "You need to get a haircut." I said, "Oh, Sergeant, I says, I don't have any money. You loan me a quarter, and I'll go get a haircut, right?" he says, "You just got paid." I said, "Look, I just got out of the brig, and that this kind of I said, I don't have any money. I gave all my friends. They've been taking care of me. I'm broke. But if you loan me a quarter, I'll go get the haircut. I'm not going to argue with you." And we went back and forth like this a couple times, and then I just blew it, and I reached back to hit him. And I have two friends that are sergeants beside me, and they say, "Dan, you don't want to do this," and he starts banging his head against this locker and says, "I've had no private in the 12, 14 years I've been in the military ever talk to me like that," and so he points to his clerk, and he tells his clerk, write him up for insubordination. And I don't know where it came from. I mean, I'm no legal mind. Again, maybe the movies, I don't know. But I said, I says, take another one out, write him up for for unduly harassment. Which I knew it was a legal argument. And so actually they wrote them both, and I have two witnesses, two sergeants, so they knew, and they were good friends. And so, just as you were saying, I came into, about a month later, I was called into the gunnery sergeant, the colonel's office, and the gunnery sergeant's secretary outside calls me in and says, "Well, Sergeant said he'll drop charges against you if you'll drop charges against him."
Imagine that.
Imagine that. Yeah. So, that's kind of like what we're talking about, when the paperwork starts, it means something in the military. These things got to balance out in some way or another, and there's a record, and if they can drop it, they'd be more than happy to drop it especially if an officer's involved in that. So I was very lucky. I was very lucky at that point. And I didn't really after that. There was a point that I think my PTSD had broken in just because a friend of mine had gone back to Vietnam, and we were told that he was killed. And that's when all this stuff started happening. And there's so many veterans right now that have gotten less than honorable discharges because they started acting out because of who knows what, something that might be related to their friends getting killed or somebody being killed or killing somebody, in war. And whatever happens to people when they're dealing with these emotional and, because you're struggling with, again, what is justice, what is right, what are the principles that we live by. Yep. And when you can't explain it, it could be you just act out in some manner that's not appropriate to your military life. That could be. So yeah, I understand that very much. I think it's important for people to understand that part of it too. So as you've been dealing with all of this, and you're coming back in the United States, you've got a deal from the Navy. You still have to go through this process coming into the United States, and so what happens from there?
Well, it was all actually pretty straightforward. I mean, I know that there had been a warrant for many years for my arrest because I was wanted for being absent without leave from the military. I know that that's a federal warrant that anyone in the U.S. can see if they bring it up. So I don't want to seem like not a trusting person, but the first thing I wanted to do was verify that the military has actually done what they said they did, that have actually been discharged, because the paperwork never actually showed up in Canada. It never arrived. And so it turned out that was being held up because of an indebtedness problem, because they took like the last month of pay that they gave me, and which I left sitting in a bank account in Virginia somewhere and never even touched it. So I don't know what happened to it, but they said I needed to pay them back a few $100s before they were going to release my paperwork. So fine, I paid that back. They sent the DD 214 discharge paperwork to me in Canada after I paid that. It looked legitimate to me. Contacted some friends in the States to assist me with hiring a private investigator in the States just to do some interstate records checks and see what's out there. And they reported back that they're not finding anything. It's like, okay, maybe this is actually legit, but it's still kind of nerve-wracking, living for the better part of 8 years, slowly coming to grips with the notion that you're never actually going to be able to go back home. You're never going to be able to go back to the States. And it's, I don't know, it's starting to feel like enemy territory or something. Despite the fact that I have so many friends here, and it just, I don't know, it starts to feel like it's sort of outside my world. And the prospect of coming back across the border was quite scary. I mean, there's always this idea, I guess the paranoid part of your brain, that maybe it's a scam, it's an elaborate ruse to get you to the border, and
Right.
then they're going to haul you away. But so in the weeks leading up to leaving, I had we decided we were going to cross, which is at Buffalo. Had some friends in Buffalo, a really good guy named Bruce Byers that I've known for a while. So he helped us make arrangements basically for landing in Buffalo. We drove, but we'd called the border station there, the Customs and Border Patrol. Talked to them, told them we're coming across, and try to get directly from them what sort of paperwork we need to have ready, like what documents we need to have ready for you to look at, all that sort of stuff. They were actually very forthcoming and very helpful, and because I was able to pull up and tell the guy at the gate in the road exactly who I had talked to in the border station about what, that was a very smooth process. Sort of emotionally braced to get harassed there or whatever, get pulled over, have the car taken apart, just because of who I am, and I know that they can see what's on the sheet, even though it's not an active warrant anymore. I know that they can see it, and there was none of that. There was a 10-minute delay to do the re-importation paperwork for the car, and it was have a nice day and welcome to the United States. That was probably the most surprising part of the entire journey.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and then.
It's interesting though when you come in across the U.S. side, the barbed wire up against the.
Yeah, it's definitely a different border from the last time I crossed it.
Yeah.
And it's we got across pretty easily and linked up with an attorney in Buffalo because if you leave not in Canadian Border Services custody, like it's not a custody transfer, which it would have been. If you leave on your own terms, you have to provide proof to them that you left the country. So, that's in the form of an affidavit that comes from outside the country that you're physically standing in front of someone there. So, so we linked up with a lawyer in Buffalo who provided that for us, faxed that back to our attorney in Toronto, and never looked back. We had decided in Toronto that with the option to pretty much throw a dart at a map of the U.S. and decide where we were going to live, that the place that really appealed to us most was, somewhere on the West Coast. I've been stationed a couple times on the West Coast. Really liked it. Lived in California. That was all right. Been to Washington several times. That was okay too. And eventually settled on trying Portland. And here we are.
Here you are. That's interesting. I said, well, Seattle, let's see, that's a real naval base area.
Yeah.
And California has a naval base area.
Yeah. And, we looked at San Francisco because they've gotten rid of their base, right?
Yeah.
It's been closed for a while, but the housing's just out of control there. So,
Yeah.
and
We're starting to get that way.
yeah. Well, I mean, Bruce had a lot to do with that decision too, because he told us, we knew we wanted to get involved in issues with veterans. I mean, my root issue is I felt like I got lied to.
Yeah.
Right. I felt a lot in a lot of different ways at a lot of different levels. I just got lied to.
Right.
And I feel like to make this better, you're not going to beat military recruiters at their own game. By necessity, they're very good at it, and the options that they're offering, when you strip them down and expose all the facts, just aren't that attractive in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
But anything that we can do to take the window dressing off of that and let people see what's actually going to happen, and then hold the government accountable for the promises that they make, I think is where we're going to make the biggest strides.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few people that I met while I was in Toronto that it's just, the conditions they're living in are just heartbreaking. Like they have crippling PTSD from their time in combat. Absolutely crippling. And the reason that they are in Canada has a lot to do with the things they were asked to do in combat, but also has a lot to do with their needs just being ignored when they came home.
Yeah.
Just turning from a soldier fighting on the front lines and the pride of our country to literal human garbage when they get off the plane back in the U.S. Like you did your job, and now we don't want to spend the money to take care of you. So we're going to deny that you have a problem. We're going to deny that there's any sort of solution to any kind of problem you might have. We're going to pretend there's nothing we could do about it if we wanted to, and just hope you go away.
Mm-hmm.
And that.
We're talking about VA.
Yeah.
Veterans Affairs.
Yep.
And not recognizing the claims that people have.
Yeah, Veterans Affairs not recognizing the real problems that discharged soldiers face, and in a lot of cases for active duty soldiers, people who have actually committed suicide, or I'm sorry, not actually committed, but attempted suicide weeks before being cleared to return to combat.
Yes.
While they're on a cocktail of medication. Being cleared to put a weapon back in their hand, put a helmet back on their head, and send them back to going door to door in Baghdad. And it just makes no sense to me.
Well, there are actually, there was a documentary produced by, sorry, I can't remember her name, Jan Hawkins, who's also on KBOO Radio, but a professor at Portland State University. And she put together this film, and I apologize to you, Jan, for not remembering the title, but it was a documentary on going back to Iraq with these young psychologists, these therapists and doctors, who were supposedly dealing with people in combat who had come back from combat to the bases, the medical ships, or whatever the place was, camp, and they'd go through this therapy, and the main purpose of those people was to get them back into combat, was to deal with them in a therapeutic way, to convince them that this is normal, which it is normal. It's normal to feel that way, but that they had a duty and a job to complete, and if it required drugs, they got that, but they would send them back out. And I thought it was unusual when I was watching that film that none questioned the idea of whether it was a legal job or whether they were actually putting other men in danger by putting people back out there. Which again is one of those catch-22s. They're trying to have.
those doctors, when you looked at it, were literally believed they were trying to help those veterans. But at the same time, it's kind of like we're talking about these principles and Nuremberg principles. Are you complicit in sending people out? Yes. I mean, these are. What is it that the military and this concept of duty pushes people to go beyond their own consciousness and saying, you know, this person should not be put back out in the field. This person needs to get therapy outside of the military stresses that he's in, you know, or her that she's in.
Yeah, I think we should start calling it what it is. I mean, it's a combat industry now.
It is.
I mean, that's what it boils down to. You know, it's not defending anyone. It's not protecting anyone. It's a combat industry, and if you're part of the machine and you're not producing, you have to be fixed.
Very much so. Okay, so now it was, I think it was Gannon who sent me an email. Said you knew Bruce Gannon? Yeah. Okay. And he sent me an email. You were coming in, and so you got you got to Portland about when? Do you remember?
It was like mid-February this year.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. So, and so when we're talking about some of these other veterans, we're talking about Veterans for Peace that are actively involved in you know, trying to find ways that these veterans that are either in Canada or coming back in here get the care they need, the legal advice that they need. Some had even in their Vietnam days had been deserters and up into Canada. And we need to also look back at President Carter actually created amnesty for the Vietnam veterans. It seems to me as so-called wars are over and we're pulling back out of Afghanistan and Iraq, except for ISIS, bringing people back in again, that somehow it's time to call for amnesty for those people who are up there and make sure that they can come back. Have you seen any calls for amnesty in this situation?
We've spoken as a group. There was an arm of VVAW actually that started talking to us.
Say VVAW.
Sorry, it's Vietnam Veterans Against the War.
Okay.
Yeah. So they have I don't want to call it a modern day counterpart in IVAW, which is Iraq Veterans Against the War, but I mean both organizations are still active and strong.
Right.
So there are members of VVAW that contacted us and reached out basically with the exact same thought as you just articulated. You know, it's time to put political pressure on the U.S. government to allow these people to come home peacefully. And I mean, we talked about it, and you know, the framework is definitely there, but I guess the question is whether or not the willingness is there, and part of the I guess part of the question you have to answer if you want to determine that is what's the tempo. All right, what's the tempo of the wars? And the reality is back then it was a lot slower. I mean, there was a significant, you know, you can't really call it a significant period of peace, but a markedly reduced activity from the U.S. military following the Vietnam War. And it just seemed like the right thing to do. I mean, there was a huge public uprising against the Vietnam War and what had happened there. And I don't want to cheapen it so much to say that it was an easy way to score political points because, you know, in the years since, I think Jimmy Carter's probably done a lot more than any sitting U.S. president to keep us out of wars. Right. And the stuff that he's done since he left office.
There was a lot of pressure. I mean, at the same time, Jimmy Carter was still supporting the regimes in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala, you know, for these and using the Schools of America to train these death squads, etc.
Yes.
I mean, he did put money into it. I mean, I admire Jimmy Carter after he became after presidency for more of what he's done, and he did a lot of, you know, some good domestic things. But all these presidents have been in some form or another supporting our military might throughout the nation, throughout the world, actually, because of these bases that are going on, building bases throughout the world. It was interesting. Just as I was at the convention, there was a letter that came to the convention. It was read at one of the plenaries, I believe, which was from Okinawa, the mayor of Okinawa, who was basically, sending out a letter praising Veterans for Peace and their support of the civilians there actually protesting new bases being built in Okinawa. And I remember Okinawa was this space where I transitioned from states to Vietnam and vice versa back. And and I remember the outside town was were just sort of, there was prostitution, there was everything was was there for the service, and there had been cases of rape and other violence in the community. And then also, I think there was just a recent report of storage of Agent Orange barrels and stuff like that there. So many bases around the country, around the world, are highly polluted, and people need to understand that it's on somebody else's national territory. And but yeah, I just thought it was interesting that we continue to try and understand this military-industrial complex, this idea that, as you said, war is a business. It's something that continues to move forward. So what was it that in Veterans for Peace, because you joined Veterans for Peace, what was it that caused you to decide to join Veterans for Peace?
Well, there's a couple of things, really. I mean, the organization is active across a number of fronts, but it's, I don't know what the right word is, it's a very steady organization. Looking from the outside in, it seemed to be, because there's a ton of different organizations, of veterans, well, maybe not a ton, but there's several different organizations for veterans that are focused either on this war or that war, or against war in general. And there are lots of peace organizations out there that are not veteran focused, but they are peace organizations. But the attractiveness to me of Veterans for Peace was that there's just a steady pace to the peace activism. It doesn't seem to get pulled apart by a lot of the politics that eventually eat at other organizations. It still has its pressures. Every organization does. But it's much more focused on what the goal is here than other organizations, in my opinion. And it's a place where I can pursue those goals and surround myself by other people that have been there. And not have to explain to everyone that I'm talking to about what things are actually like over there, what a ship looks like. Not have to explain every single acronym and so forth, right? It's people that speak the same language. So you can skip past a lot of the introduction and get to the goal, get to what we're trying to do. So that's the attractiveness of it for me. It's a lot of people that are more seasoned.
And there's that, you were talking earlier about the idea that you weren't against, or I would probably say you were probably saying that there may be the possibility of just war. The idea of self-defense. And, I think I have that same idea or problem in the sense that there are a number of people within Veterans of Peace that are literally pacifists and all wars, no matter what. And I often say to myself, I'm on the path to trying to become that.
I say the exact same thing.
Is that right? Because I'm not sure I'm all there. I am
if somebody attacks my family, I'm the person that's going to defend my family. If somebody attacks our nation, on the shores of our nation, not some hypothetical preemptive
Right.
war, then then maybe I'm getting old enough now to say I never want to pick up a gun ever again in my life. Never have to be in a position to shoot another human being. So. I'm closer to the full pacifist, but
Yeah.
I'm not. We're coming to the end of the program, and I just wanted to say thank you again for coming to the show and following up on the last part. I want to also let people know, there is you can always contact Veterans for Peace Chapter 72 through our website, which is up on the board here. And there is a program called Vietnam Full Disclosure, which is an organization I'm on sort of the core committee of this organization, which is basically Vietnam veterans that are dealing counter argument to the DOD's whitewashing the Vietnam War. And we have an incredible website. The website's up there, www.vietnamfulldisclosure.org, in which we're chronicling the history of GI resistance, individual stories, correcting the DOD's website and their false analogies, so that you have an opportunity to read these articles on actually, if you're a teacher, build a curriculum so that students understand these principles that veterans we've been talking about in this program, so that veterans and civilians and people even considering going in the military know what those principles really stand for, and that you can stand up for them. There's so much that I would love to say. Again, shout out to Barbara Gurwell for her father's passing, Ralph William Gurwell, Presente. And again, you can contact me for any more information, Dan Shea, djshea@hotmail.com. And I think that's, we've come to the end. We've got maybe a minute left. Is there any last words you'd like to say?
Wow, the pressure. Yeah, I can't really think of much, besides we have to keep pushing. All right, remember that the goal is just to get people to stop picking up the rifle.
That's the goal. Thank you, and I think I'll just ask people to remember that we are on every fourth Saturday of the month. So check in with us, and I don't even know what the next program is going to be, but we'll figure it out by then. I'm sure we'll have dozens of people here. Thank you very much, and thank you for watching Veterans for Peace Forum.